Good morning, everybody. My name is Lee Holstock from the Soil Association Certification. Welcome to our Brexit update webinar for March. This is the second of our webinars. We felt that there's been enough progress with regard to Brexit clarification to update as many as you possibly can. Before I start and hand over to our Chief Executive, Martin Sawyer, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, in terms of the running order, then we will be covering a number of topics. First of all, we're talking about the general context. So Martin will give you a view of where we are at the moment. For those of you who aren't aware of the current status of the UK in relation to the EU and organic regulations, I would add that this is all in the context of no deal, so we are assuming that that will be the case, and all the information we're providing you will assume that. So the implications for organic trade we will cover. We'll talk about some of the importing and exporting of organic, and we'll also then talk about labelling. And finally, we'll talk about some of the recent activity, some of the things that we've been doing in order to help progress and deliver some clarity. Just in terms of the questioning, it would ask if you would kindly keep your questioning to the end. And as there are a number of you, our experience of these webinars has been that it's more practical for us to ask you to use the chat function to ask us those questions during the Q&A session at the end. So if you'd like to do that, and Martin will do his best to pick out those questions and give you some answers. We will also be recording this, and we would be sharing the presentation slides with the audio. So if you are not happy for those questions and Martin's subsequent answers to be shared with our wider licensing community, then do let us know. Otherwise, we will share this with you early next week, but you will be able to download a copy of this presentation and the slides immediately at the end of the session. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Martin in just a second, so if you just bear with us and we will begin.
Good morning, everybody. Martin Sawyer from the Soil Association. Thanks, Lee. Okay, it's never easy trying to talk when I know you're out there, really, but I can't see you, so I'm just going to plough on, and hopefully this all makes sense for you as we go along. I'll work my way through the slides and try and talk my way through. Obviously, if you've got questions, as Lee said, if you just maybe make some notes as you go, and then we'll pick it up at the chat end at the end of the presentation. Okay, so some of this I know hopefully is fairly well understood by now, and so let's start with what we do know, and to an extent what's the easiest part of all this. So all this is on a clear assumption that either the UK leaves on a no-deal basis at the end of March, or for that matter, it could now be the end of June, as we know, based on the current discussions going on. But it's that key principle. So if there is any level of agreement, any level of deal with the transition, then all I'm about to talk to an extent starts to get put to the corner, and we can have a different type of conversation. So in terms of if we leave, obviously, first things first, the UK obviously continues with its premise of producing product of a standard, and the key piece obviously is the European reg will be adopted across into the UK, and we will carry on within the UK specifically, applying a very consistent and similar approach, in fact an identical approach to the EU reg within the UK specifically in terms of production and labelling. And the UK organic certification bodies that you'll know obviously can continue quite appropriately to carry on certifying product for domestic use within the UK. So it's quite straightforward. The piece that's become very clear is that the UK as a whole, in other words, as a sort of DEFRA UK space, doesn't appear to be in a position where it's going to get a mutual equivalence in this horizon with the EU. So one original and ideally the preferential route was that there'll be a country-to-country solution, which meant that once that had been agreed, all the CBs by default would be able to operate across the border without having to do any individual actions. But that looks to be unlikely based on the most recent conversations that DEFRA have fed back to the CBs within the last 10 days. And the reason for that, incidentally, is because we believe the Commission are disinclined to get involved with mutual equivalent agreements anywhere globally now. That's not their direction they're headed for, and they don't, I think, want to make an exception for the UK. But like everything else in Brexit, who knows? Maybe that will move on and change. So at the moment, the current approach is that the UK, in a no-deal space, businesses would only be able to export into the EU if the organic certification bodies in the UK have managed to gain recognition from the EU Commission to operate the UK effectively as a scope under the 1235 third country status. And now we already operate that status for operations in a number of other third countries, but not specifically for the UK, because clearly currently we're still a member state. The problem we had and still remains, although we can explore it slightly, is that as we sit here still at the moment, that ability to apply for that scope still is locked down till that we can't apply to the Commission technically until the UK has left the EU, which if you take March as the indicator would be the 30th of March. Now, I am aware that there are discussions continuing to try and see if there's a way of progressing around that. And I'll come back to that, sorry. So the Soil Association, obviously we're continuing to make preparations for that. It's quite complex because we have to get international accreditation through IOAS, and that requires us to also both share our standards with IOAS, do a desktop review, and also have witnessed inspections against all the scopes that we'll be applying for before we actually put the file into the Commission. So and we are committing to all that currently, and that work actually is underway, including a plan for visits from iOS to a number of locations to undertake witnessed inspections. However, I am aware that DEFRA are trying to explore a fast-track route through the Commission, where they get all the UK certifiers obviously fast-track through. And I believe at this moment, DEFRA have written to the Commission asking them whether, under an exceptional circumstance, whether the UCAS UK accreditation would be accepted as a way of bridging everybody over this journey into the early months of a no-deal moment, rather than having to get the international IIAS accreditation. And that letter was sent, I believe, to the Commission last week. And we will, everyone is awaiting an answer to that, because that will make a massive difference in terms of the complexity of trying to get the scope approval through the Commission. And we believe that if that was possible, there may even be a mindset within the Commission to effectively fast track the applications, even possibly in advance of the 30th of March, in which case we could have genuinely a seamless journey across, even in a no-deal space for the organic sector. But all that is really very live at the moment, and I would imagine we'll know far more around that particular approach probably by midweek next week, we believe. If we don't get that approval in terms of UCAS use, and we continue to have to use IOAS, I think it's more complex, and I think it's unlikely that the CBs in the UK, most of the CBs for sure, will be in any position to be ready pre the 30th of March, just by the very nature, it's such a slow process to get the accreditation sorted out. Okay, so yeah. So moving on then, so importing into the UK from the EU, acceptance from the EU, obviously, of certified products still remains at the discretion of the UK, and obviously there's this continued process of whether the UK is minded to use it as a negotiating position against exports. I think in a public voice, they're probably saying that that's what they may still do. I suspect privately there is a desire not to create that level of disruption for imports, and a recognition of the high dependency on many businesses of imported materials from the EU. And therefore, I think actually there will be a unilateral view on imports that allows that to continue. And actually, The positive message there also is that it's pretty certain that there would, if products coming in from the EU certified by an EU certifier, then actually there'll be no further checks or paperwork requirements. So nothing would change effectively against the current way that you would bring product in from the EU, which is different to what we believed was going to happen, where we thought they were going to put it onto even from EU imports onto a paperwork traces equivalent system. We are now pretty clear that's not going to happen, and actually there'll be a minimal interference, effectively no checks, no paperwork additional coming in from EU imports, which is good news, I think, in terms of most of you involved with importing materials, and therefore no need for import COIs. Importing into the UK from outside the EU, obviously the UK will continue to recognise products from all of the 11 EU approved third countries, and all the 1, 2, 3, 5 approved certifiers in other third countries. And that's obviously based on the fact that we're bringing the European law across into the UK law. Now, in that case, in many respects, in the immediacy pre the March the 29th, everyone should remain as they are currently, who are importing from outside of the European space, by using the Traces NT system. And that will be active right up for the UK up until literally when the clock strikes at midnight as we flip over into the 30th of March. And the UK, meanwhile, is progressing trials to the point of going live with a paperwork equivalent traces system for third country imports, which would be effective from effectively the 30th of March. And from what we're being told, the UK system will effectively, obviously, require the exporter to complete the certification for endorsement by the exporter certification body. The UK ports have been advised, which is the key piece, I think, for all of you, to use a very pragmatic approach during the transition period, and they will accept the EU COIs, i.e. the Traces NT system, after the 29th for imports that are coming in from third countries. And obviously what they'll be expecting is that anything that's being effectively shipped right up to the moment of the no deal moment, they'll recognise that they'll be on the Traces NT system, and therefore that product will be accepted through the ports under that basis. And at some stage they recognise that product will start turning up in the ports after the 30th of March, which would then have with it the new paperwork traces system equivalent. So what we would say, however, is that licensees do need to start informing customers that this will be the new requirement for importing goods. The UK port authorities should probably be informed if goods are due to arrive without the new UK COI. So in other words, if you have knowledge that it's going to be coming in under Traces NT, I think it would be totally in your interests to let the ports know that that's the way the documentation will arrive for those products that are in that transitional moment. And obviously licensees ensure that goods travel with paper COIs, as the ports may not have access to a Traces NT system, because that is still part of the negotiation that's going on about whether the UK will still get line of sight of the Traces NT system even in that transition moment. And obviously additional checks may take place on higher risk items, information required to be confirmed. Obviously that's still impending. Goods imported in via the EU ports, we're not yet fully clear how this is going to operate, but we are trying to seek clarification through DEFRA. Two options we think could exist. Goods authorised to enter the EU where a certified importer is based in the EU and goods are cleared by the EU port of entry would be the responsibility of the EU, and goods then become an EU to UK movement, and as such, as described earlier, there'll be no COI requirement. Good importers who are based and then licensed in the UK, then the UK has clearance responsibility for those, and a UK COI will be required regardless of that point of entry, whether it's coming initially through the UK or the EU. And obviously if the importer is UK based but the consignment lands in the EU, goods cannot be distributed or sold as organic in the EU, and it will need to be transited directly into the UK. I'm sure you may have some questions on that as we go along. Okay, so after the 30th of March then, UK exporters will need to be registered as either an exporter or a producer on the European traces system. So that's the other key piece, where obviously that's new to all of you who are, some of you will obviously be used to, well, no, that's new to all of you really who are facing into Europe. And obviously that's an electronic system. And we are aware that the UK is hoping to negotiate access to traces so that UK exporters can register, but this function is not yet available, and we'll advise as soon as it is. Now, clearly that's going to become quite critical. We're already into March as of today, and if this was to be the 29th of March, then clearly you'll want to be in a large queue at the end trying to get on the system. So we will chase that pretty hard over the next week or so and really make sure that as soon as we get the knowledge that system is open for registering and it's set up for UK businesses, that we'll let you know it's happening. The UK exporters will need to create obviously a COI on traces ahead of every shipment. And given that obviously the UK will not require COIs for goods coming from the EU to the UK, it is hoped that the EU would not require COIs from the UK. But as we stand at the moment, this is unconfirmed. And therefore, we're continuing to assume that we will have to have a traces NT system operating from the UK into Europe. And we'll see how this progresses, really. It's not clear yet how long it'll take for all the UK exporters to register and create a COI, but you also need to be aware that your certifier does have to complete consignment checks, a degree of traceability, and therefore it's not just a straight sort of simple process of signing it through. There is a requirement on the certification bodies to undertake some level of traceability. So be aware that there will be a lag in the way this process operates, and we are having to, within the certification bodies, and particularly here because of the number of licenses we have are involved with export into Europe, you can imagine actually we've got quite a significant upskilling and training requirement we've got to do in-house here now to try and prepare the staff for this particular additional activity. Yeah. Okay, so we are notifying the UK companies of the potential need to start using traces, obviously, and we'll confirm as soon as we know we have that access. If you're currently registered on traces as an importer from a third country and or an operator, you obviously still need to have a request on the system for a change of role to an exporter or producer once the function is available. So don't take it for granted that because you're already on the system, that effectively means that you'll be able to operate specifically on this movement between the UK and Europe. And obviously any developments will be communicated obviously on our website through the Cert News, and we'll run another public webinar if as these things become more clear. And when the time comes to be registered on traces, we'll try and have on-hand guidance and support for licensees from the certification team here. So please, and this is really quite a key one for all of you, is just obviously keep checking Cert News and the website for any developments, and clearly we'll do our absolute best as soon as we get some sense of confidence of what is being published to get it out to you. Okay, so that sort of tries to cover off the movement between the EU and the UK and the UK and the EU. Exporting then to non-EU countries, so in this case excluding the US and South Korea, the paperwork, as best we understand it, will resemble that already exists in place now, but will be dependent on the UK trade deals being established with each of the countries. We believe that Chile has been signed. That needed to go through Parliament, I think, as I understood it. Agreements with the other countries, including Argentina, India, Japan, Switzerland, South Korea, and Israel, are all currently going through legal process. And what we mean by that, as I understand it, is in many cases the letters are drafted. there's a whole set of check processes that go on through DEFRA with the legals, but actually they seem to have a relatively high level of confidence that they will all be in play before the 29th of March if necessary. The US and New Zealand are bilateral arrangements, and they will also need to recognise the UK. DEFRA are working with them to ensure that this recognition is in place for the day we leave, so the exports can continue. And at this time of writing, we've not heard that they're likely to be delayed. Again, the US, I believe, is a very technically detailed set of letters and notes, and that's the only thing really that's effectively causing it to slow down, is just simply getting that process checked out through the DEFRA legal teams. But they seem to have the confidence that that will all be in play. Australia is a unilateral arrangement, so it will be up to the importers and certifiers as to whether they recognise the UK standards and allow imports. And then finally for MB, for goods leaving obviously the UK bound for non-EU countries, we currently use export certificates. The NOP import certificates continue to be used for the US and NAQS for South Korea, all of which are endorsed, but obviously this may change going forward. So as a summary on non-European movement in terms of countries, DEFRA continue to express a strong level of confidence that most of those deals will be structured and in place to provide, as best they would describe it, as a seamless transition on the 29th of March. If we hear anything differently and they start to stumble on any of those, we'll let you know. Okay, so labelling. Okay, so the use of the EU leaf, and there has been some technical, an update paper that was put out by DEFRA, I think now about a week ago, on the technical. So I'll try and give it a summary. The EU says not permitted for use in the UK after the 30th of the 3rd. However, the UK government have asked trading standards to take a pragmatic approach, and my understanding of that is that there is no appetite in the UK from a DEFRA or a sort of legal perspective to drive a requirement to the trading standards to pursue businesses in getting the leaf packaging mark off in any short horizon. So I think that can be short-term parked as a concern. But you will obviously find that the sort of the legal guidance, if you want to describe it, that clause is that in theory, legally, it shouldn't be there. However, obviously, we cannot approve new labels with the EU logo, which would make sense. If you're starting to have packaging changes, then clearly that's where it's the appropriate moment to take it off. But for all existing labels, there's a pragmatic approach that we've taken in regards to timescale for removing it. So it's an obvious thing to consider taking out as you have packaging changes or opportunities going forward. And we will obviously continue to discuss the labelling compliance issue with other CBs and DEFRA to make sure that there's a consistency approach and that we don't suddenly find that someone either starts at a trading standards level, turning up in one local region, or that one of the CBs is continuing, particularly on, I think, new labels, to continue allow the EU logo to be put on the packaging, because that is not going to be smart. For exports to non-EU, we advise obviously checking with the organic authority in that export market whether the label certification will be accepted. So again, we'll continue to try and get guidance as it becomes to surface, really. And the use of the EU organic leaf is obviously a moot point for exports. If the UK can gain access to the EU, the leaf can continue to be used. If not, then goods may not move after the 30th of the 3rd anyway. So effectively, as we know, that my understanding is that if we have any sense of transition or approach, or the CBs have an agreement, the EU probably will have a vested interest in retaining having the EU leaf on packaging coming out of the UK into the European market, because they want to promote the EU leaf. Clearly, if we have no scope agreements or no equivalents, there'll be no movement to goods anyway. So the EU consumer contact address, which is quite a key one, really. So a removal of other EU marks, references, etc. So for goods sold in the UK, any required changes will not be expected to be made over 21 months. So effectively, DEFRA and the UK are taking a view of almost applying what was the original transition period against these ideas of longer term changes, even in a no deal space. They're not going to try and impose any early changes in the UK sense, and they're saying they'll use a 21-month period as a period of transition. However, in terms of what the EU insists on, obviously that's up to the EU, and that tends to be the standard answer I get from DEFRA whenever I ask the question. And therefore, no way of knowing what they're going to insist on. Some importers are asking already for correct packaging immediately from the 30th of March, and some oversticking may be required. And obviously then there's a definition of what goods placed in the market means, which is complex. But as we best understand it, and the guidance we're trying to get, I think is as clear as it can be. If goods are already on the continent on the 30th of March, we believe that will not be an issue. We do believe, however, that products that are in the UK at that moment will fall under the challenge of the no deal pace, actually. Oh, sorry. You move on. Okay, so recent activity, just to give you a catch up, obviously Source Association is heavily involved with lobbying the EU IFOAM, and I actually think that's helped, if I'm being honest with you. Looking at the journey that's happening with the Commission, there's definitely been movement both from noises from the UK directly, but also through the international bodies like IFOAM in representing the broader agenda for the European countries and the European producers and processors, that the importance of having a two-way movement of goods is critical. And I do think that's why we're starting to see some positive noises out of the Commission. You may have seen that we published a letter into Michael Gove and to Liam Fox actually last week through Helen. That was an intentional to keep everything as high profile as possible so that we don't lose track in terms of the criticality of the organic piece when it comes to no deal. And that was published through the Independent and has then gone out into a broader coverage. And we're trying to make sure that this stays very vocally aware across the whole of the press space, really, so that it doesn't get lost. We'll keep obviously updating our Brexit pages as anything occurs, and we are meeting along with the other certifiers regularly, either through phone, Skype call, or whether through direct face-to-face with the DEFRA team, keeping right on top of how to try and resolve this. And in fact, the proposal to approach the Commission around the use of UCAS really came out of the most recent conversations, and was a very positive way of trying to see if we thought we could get some movement with the Commission. And to be fair to DEFRA, they grasped that immediately and have gone off to approach the Commission over it. So next steps, really, obviously, it goes beyond, without trying to talk about the obvious. We will carry on banging the drum in the DEFRA discussions, in the IFOAM discussions, towards the government ministers, and keeping this as high a profile as possible, so that it absolutely doesn't drop off the agenda if the UK does face this no deal moment. That our whole objective here is to end up with a no loss of any continuity in terms of movement, both into the EU and from the EU to the UK for organic. A one day break for us is absolutely a failure. We do not want to see that occur. Obviously, there's ongoing dialogue with DEFRA to clarify their processes in terms of managing the discussions. And there is a second piece. I don't know if you're aware of it. There's been some questions asked from DEFRA about how there could be some mitigation towards business losses, and that was partly also covered, I think, in Helen's letter, actually. And it's a challenging area, as you're well aware. There's a difference between obviously maybe looking at the farming space, where it's maybe slightly easier in terms of the history of how grants may be loaded in there. Things like, for instance, loss of status of lamb, or the tariff issue around lamb as an example. And there is a debate about whether there would be compensation or some sort of scheme put in place to try and offset against that. And I'm sure that may be true of other animals and products and on a primary basis. It's harder to think about how to structure it for processors, particularly when it comes to obviously potential loss of sales or other costs incurred. But that is certainly a conversation that I know has been surfaced now in the DEFRA space and through government, and therefore there's no harm in surfacing that and trying to provide some sense of indication, and we're starting to get our heads around that as to, and obviously we'll be talking with all of you, I'm sure, in anything that we can feed back into DEFRA. But to give you some idea, there have been questions that were originally asked, which I know Helen again raised in her letter, which shows you some of the innocence of the thinking, which was whether you could, for instance, push organic ingredients into Europe but actually sell them as non-organic, or whether you could sell organic finished product in the in Europe as non-organic. And of course, we've tried to explain pretty obviously that neither of those is at all appropriate or in any sense of value to the businesses, or for that matter to the retailers or the further processors. Businesses, I think, should still continue with contingency planning, and I do know a number of businesses that are either putting finished stock out into Europe, pulling ingredients into the UK, and sadly I'm also aware that some licensees are well down plans to move production of product out of the UK into European countries to enable them to have a guaranteed access across the EU of product. So I think that's probably me talk for too long. So we'll throw over to questions. I think Lee will now manage that for me, if you don't mind. So I'm going to hand you over.
Thank you very much, Martin. So as we indicated at the beginning, I noticed that one or two of you have already discovered the chat function and have started to push some questions through to us. So just to remind you, if you do have any questions, I don't think that we can probably cope with the audio option with so many people on the call, but if you could type them into the chat function, then Martin and I will do our best to answer those. So we have already had one question regarding clarification on the US and whether or not current UK certification is acceptable. The EU does have equivalence with the US currently, and obviously as we exit the EU, then we won't benefit from that equivalence. As Martin has indicated already, the letters are being exchanged. The process is ongoing between our government and the US, and we hope we will have some kind of agreement in place by the 30th. However, at the moment, if you don't have a specific NOP certification, then your goods would not be acceptable in the US until we have that clarification. And equally, the USDA logo or seal would be the same related issue. So I hope that clarifies that. But if you do have any other questions, then yeah, do let us know. Just to clarify, additionally, we have a very high hope that the UK situation will be resolved by the 30th of March. Right, I've seen a couple of other questions coming up here, so we're going to continue to look at those as well. So bear with me one moment. We've got a question there regarding the. I'll read these out because we have been used to a one-day timescale for turnaround of COIs and export certificates. Can this still be achieved after your training and additional staff and also process? So I'm going to hand back to Martin, and I'll drive this messaging function for him and let him answer those questions, if that's okay. Bear with me one moment.
Okay, sorry, hi. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the answer is until we actually get a real sense of the expectation from the Commission about the level of traceability and process we've got to go through, I think we're not absolutely sure of the timescale per clearance. I think clearly our objective is to turn it around as fast as possible, but I think until we get a sense of what's coming at us, both in terms of volume and complexity, I can't give you, at this very moment, a guarantee of what that will look like. Okay, so there's another question here. It says, will there be a replacement for the EU logo anytime soon? I assume by that you mean within the UK as a UK mark. My understanding from DEFRA, again, probably now about 3 weeks ago, is maybe the latest time they've probably talked about this, is there really is no current ambition within the UK to create, in the short term anyway, a generic UK mark. So I believe they will run effectively with their effectively the certifier marks as the current space. I have no doubt that that will come back on the agenda at some stage, but if I'm being truthful with you, I think it'll be sort of 3 years forward rather than in the next 6 months. So at the moment, no, I think the UK will just run with its certifier marks. When do we expect to see the UK COI version? That's the Trace's piece, yeah. We are being told from the DEFRA team that they are expecting to publish the guidance, which will include the downloadable document, somewhere around about mid-March. That's their sort of timetable. They are running a trial with a number of licensees, some of whom may be online here actually, currently actually on running the paperwork trial. But I'm told it'll be around about mid-March, which I know is not very long before the go date, but that's the time they're running to. Okay, another one here. In the event of a no deal, if a UK business is to gain EU organic certification, will this allow them to still export? Okay, in the end of a no deal. Right, okay, so bear with me, sorry. To export, if that's from the UK to the EU, then whoever, whether it's EU standard or whether it's a higher standard, you will still require the certification body to have got the scope as a third country certification body for the UK to allow that export to take place. So if you like, whether it was one of the 5 or 6 UK certification bodies, or whether for that matter it was one of the European certifiers, everyone has the same challenge, which they all have to apply for the UK scope as a third country. Okay, so bear with me a second. So the vast majority of our suppliers are EU, and they grow, produce, and package within their facilities. Only UK packaging is sent to us here in the UK. All EU packaging products are sent to a warehouse that we have in Germany. How will Brexit affect us? Okay, I would have said that on that basis, most of your suppliers are in the EU. They grow, produce, and package in their own facilities in Europe. One assumes, from their perspective, if their products are then being sold around Europe, no problem. Effectively, completely normal space. Product that's being sent from those businesses into the UK with a UK packaging style. Assuming that there is this unilateral approach from the UK on allowing all imports from the EU, certified imports to the UK, to come in effectively seamlessly, I would have said that you would have, or should have, minimal impact actually when it comes to production or product being then sold within the UK. It should be pretty seamless. The only thing that would trip us is the issue of the UK decided to not allow European imports because they were trying to negotiate forcing through the export window. But I suspect, based on what we believe at the moment, you should be pretty much untouched by the process. Yeah, apologies. The only issue obviously may be the use of the EU leaf on your UK packaging domestic sale product in the UK, that you may or may not be that leaf needs to come off the packaging, but probably not immediately. Back to the issue of the UK taking a view that would be over a period of time. Maybe again, if you had your next packaging run, that would be when you would take it off. Okay, sorry. Are you able to have dual organic certification? Sorry, I'm trying to get my head around that question for you. Are you able to have dual certification? I'm trying to think in the context. If you were, for instance, if you had EU certified product, in other words, it's your certificate, you're certified in the EU itself, then you're clearly you're fine in terms of how you sell your product around around the EU, and for that matter, you can also bring product into the UK. If you're thinking about the terms, if you're a UK producer, is the value in having effectively a Dutch certification, in other words, an EU certification? It really boils down to where the product's being made. Really, if the product's manufactured in the UK or being processed in the UK, your primary certificate will have to come from the UK, and therefore that doesn't help you bridge your way out of this problem of a no deal if there is no scope in the UK. The only way that you would be able to avoid that is effectively not have the production in the UK in the first place. So I think, I don't know if that's answered your question or not. Actually, if feel free to type that back if that's not answering it. Okay, so the comment you put here is, my understanding of the dual certification thing is that we can, but it's not an advantage to bridge any gap, as it's expected to be quicker for the UK CBs to get accreditation to certify in the UK to EU regs once the UK is a third country, than for the for the EU certifiers to achieve the same accreditation to certify in the UK. None of it can be progressed until we are a third country. That's correct. I mean, fundamentally, there everybody's in the same pot, I think, in this situation. Everybody will have to, whether it was a European certifier trying effectively, don't forget, for the first time to an extent, consider looking at the UK as a third country scope opportunity, or whether it's a UK certifier having to get UK scope as a third country. Everyone has to go through the same process effectively. Okay, do we then need to have the UK registered address removed from the EU packaging for sale within the EU and have an EU registered address in order to use the leaf symbol? Or can we have both registered addresses on packaging, both UK and EU? Good question. I think that's driven partly by, and that's one of the challenges I get from talking to DEFRA, is they'll argue that's decided by the EU themselves. I would have thought, and we will check this out and come back as best we can, that as long as if you're selling product into the EU, as long as you've got a EU registered address on the packaging, having a UK address on as well as probably may not be a problem. However, I think we need to clarify whether it's appropriate to put two addresses on or not, really, or whether the EU insists only on having a EU-based address for EU sold product. So if we don't mind, we'll take that offline and we'll try and see if we can get further clarification on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin. We are now at 10:47, so the 45 minutes that we have scheduled is up. So I'm going to call questions to a close. If you do have any further questions, then do make direct contact with us. I'll ensure that everybody who is invited to this webinar, who is on this webinar, has my email address afterwards, and do direct those back to me. And I will also send you a copy of the final audio recording. So thank you very much for all of your questions, and thank you you very much for joining us this morning. We hope that Martin and I have provided some useful additional clarity. We would suggest that it is, of course, a moving feast. We are getting weekly updates from both DEFRA, and we will do our best to clarify those, gain a full understanding of their implications and meaning, and ensure that our information is updated. So just to reiterate what Martin has said earlier on, do keep your eyes out for certification news emails that go out to all of our licensees, and there is a Sword Association main Brexit landing page, so we will do our utmost to ensure that both this webinar information and any other information they have is updated as frequently as possible on that web page. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you.